Okay, so how I'm going to go through part of NEPA is actually go through some cases when NEPA first came out and how courts interpreted the requirements of NEPA. And I have these, the full text of these cases posted in the supplemental materials if you would like to look at them further. Okay, so first one is this Calvert Cliffs Coordinating Committee versus the Atomic Energy Commission. And so a plaintiff's citizen group, right? We learned about how they can have standing under certain acts. So they sued under NEPA, saying that their regulations didn't satisfy didn't satisfy NEPA. Um, so NEPA is this broad delegation of authority to agencies. All federal agencies have to consider environmental preservation before they do something. And there are certain procedural measures that they have to do. And the Atomic Energy Commission says that, oh, NEPA is vague, there's room for discretion, and the rules that they have made falls within that. Okay, so this was our first court review of NEPA requirements. And one of the things that the Atomic Energy Commission argued was that, we have to watch these NEPA lawsuits because we don't want this flood of litigation uh, intervening in federal agency action. But the court did hold that the rules that AEC implemented didn't comply with this policy set forth in NEPA. It talks about NEPA as a procedural law. There is discretion and a balancing. But although, what you're balancing, how they balance in the final decision of the agency is not regulated by NEPA, the process is strict. Okay, so they have to create these detailed statements on the environmental assessment, environmental impact. They have to think of alternatives. And that statement itself, which we'll talk about the details of that in the course of this class, is evidence that you have complied with NEPA. So the AEC did not do that. Okay, it says, that language in the policy to the fullest extent possible, right? That as much as practicable. Okay, and this Calvert Cliffs case proves that NEPA is not, a paper tiger, right? That it has actual teeth, right? Those that we were talking about on the first screen. Okay, and the requirements of NEPA are enforceable by the courts. So the DC Circuit recognizes that Congress intended the courts to actually enforce the requirements of NEPA. Okay, so they had a rule stating that the hearing board did not have to consider environmental factors. Wasn't proper under NEPA because NEPA said environmental factors have to be considered. Even though NEPA didn't come up with a real timetable, that doesn't justify the commission's delay in adopting their own NEPA procedures. And the hearing board couldn't rely on other agencies complying with NEPA. They had to do it as well. They had to do their own independent evaluation, and they had to consider environmental factors when they're issuing operating permits, even if there had been a permit issued prior to NEPA's effective date. Okay, so really says the Atomic Energy Commission, yes, you have to follow NEPA and you have to follow the process. Okay, so when does NEPA apply? Okay, so NEPA applies to agency actions that have individually or cumulatively, sorry, have a significant effect on the human environment. They call them major actions. Okay, it applies to any major action of an agency. Non-major actions are not governed by NEPA. So, the Department of Health and Human Services is moving from the 4th floor to the 7th floor of the same building. That we don't need to follow NEPA for that. That is a non-major action. So any minor federal involvement may be exempted from NEPA. So a lot of times agencies like, oh, well, yeah, that was a non-major action, so NEPA doesn't apply. And then, that might be up to the courts to decide whether or not that is a non-major action. Okay, so our step one in our NEPA compliance is it a major federal action? If it's a major federal action, yes, NEPA complies. Okay, so here's an example, a case where they're trying to figure out if there was a major federal action. Okay, so this is the Bureau of Land Management. Okay, and they, managed some federal land in southern Utah, and they were allowing, ATV use, recreational ATV use in this federal land. Okay, so the citizens group sought an injunction. Um, there was a policy for the Utah public lands at that point, to retain these lands for multiple use. Congress was maybe considering whether some of these lands were going to be preserved as wilderness. And when there is a wilderness designation, you have you can't, it's just for wilderness. You can't have any other uses there. Okay, so that's kind of our background. And the court did hold that there was no major federal action. Okay, the court stated that NEPA requires the agencies to take a hard look. Okay, that's what they're saying. They just need you to look at it. Okay, and NEPA action, a NEPA cause of action could proceed only when the agency failed to follow one of these processes that it was required to take. Okay, so the plaintiffs, right, that citizen group said that the Bureau of Land Management violated its mandate and continued to manage them as they were not wilderness. So, they when they were trying to be evaluated for wilderness areas. But this mandate, the mandate does, because it was currently a multi-use mandate, the BLM had a great deal of discretion. The statute itself had nothing about whether off-road vehicles should be used or excluded. Okay. There was no ongoing major federal action that requires, so it's kind of like, this is what they do. They manage it for multiple uses. This is a multiple use. So they're saying we don't have to do anything else. So the court said that. So that's an example. Okay. They had off-road vehicle use. They were not wilderness lands. They had a mandate for multiple uses. So they did not, there was no ongoing major federal action. Now, if they were going to develop a certain area as a ski resort, yeah, that would be a major federal action. Okay, so that's the first requirement, right? Is it a major action? The next thing you look at, there are a lot of federal agency actions that are subject to what we call a categorical exclusion. Oh my gosh, my mouth today. Or CE. In environmental law, everything is an abbreviation. So a federal agency kind of goes through what they do or what they're planning to do with their kind of day-to-day stuff, and they list what they think should be excluded from NEPA. And then the CEQ reviews that list and says, okay, yay or nay. Okay, so the agency has determined with CEQ approval that what they're doing does not either individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. Okay, so then we don't need to perform an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. Okay, so this is just kind of an administrative tool to avoid paperwork for kind of like a lot of what federal agencies do. As you see, 90 to 95% of agency actions are classified as categorical exclusions. And if you look in the textbook on page 155, there's examples of categorical exclusions from the Energy Policy Act. So, right. So that's okay. Is it a major action? Is there a categorical exclusion? So those are, the first two steps you're taking to see whether you need to go through this NEPA process. Okay, step 3, if it is a major action with no categorical exclusion, the first thing that an agency must do is conduct what we call an environmental assessment. Okay, an environmental assessment, or EA, is your step 1 in the process to determine determine the environmental impact of a proposed agency action. Okay, so it's like a screening project. Is there any impact? Okay, so they want to dam up a river, right? Will that action have an environmental impact? Probably, if you're damming up a river, yes. Okay, one of the first things they said, is this project needed at all? Why are we damming up this river? Well, we want hydroelectric power. Do we have enough power from different sources? Okay, is that project needed at all? If it is needed, what are more environmentally friendly alternatives for implementing the project? And then figuring out and writing up any anticipated environmental impacts of every single alternative that you're coming up with. Okay, so this is the environmental impact of what your proposed action is, and this is the environmental impact of the alternatives. In your environmental assessment, any people you've interviewed, any agencies you've consulted with have to be listed in the environmental assessment. It's supposed to be concise, objective, and well balanced. You may, at this point, solicit public input on this proposed government action, but it's not required at the EA stage. The other thing that the EA should include are mitigation measures. Okay, so we're going to dam up this river, but these are things that we are going to do to reduce any environmental harm. Okay, after the EA, the agency has to figure out, well, will there be a significant impact? Okay, so if not, there's something called a finding of no significant impact, acronym FONSI. If there is a finding of no significant impact, like, yeah, it's not going to be a big deal, then you're done. The agency is done under NEPA. Okay, so here's a case, 2004. There had been a moratorium on Mexican trucks driving on U.S. roads, because of their emissions, right? Their pollution emissions. Okay, so under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexican trucks were allowed on our roads. And the Department of Transportation issued rules for Mexican trucks, including, emissions and things like that. But they did not file an environmental impact statement. Okay, they did an environmental assessment and they issued what we call a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. So on their rulemaking, so they're like, okay, we're done. Okay, the plaintiff, the citizens group, claimed that finding was arbitrary and capricious. This finding of no significant impact. Actually, but the court didn't really even get to that. They said that the DOT could not overrule the president with these rules at all, right? Because of NAFTA. They could only regulate and inspect the trucks, and they couldn't, even if they had filed an environmental impact statement that, I don't know, somehow said these certain trucks couldn't be allowed, NAFTA would override that. So they couldn't require it. So that, it would kind of like exceed the mandate of DOT. So anyway, it was kind of like a big non-starter. The plaintiffs group said, no, you should do an EIS. And the court's like, well, even if we did an EIS and they changed what they were going to do, wouldn't make any difference because we have to comply with NAFTA. Okay, so now we're on our Next little stuff are procedural requirements of NEPA. Okay, so Winston Churchill, never a bad idea to quote Winston Churchill. Plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. Okay, so we first thing, right? Is there a major action? Is there a categorical exclusion? If not, we do this environmental assessment. After the environmental assessment, the agency determines whether there is significant impact. If they say no, there's no significant impact, then we have to file an environmental impact statement. Okay, so that's kind of like that's the NEPA requirements in a nutshell there. Okay, so then is there a finding of no significant impact? Okay, we have the Fonz. I don't know if any of you guys remember the Fonz or know who he is, but here's Fonzie here. So if the first look, right, that environmental assessment indicates that there's little environmental impact, an agency may conclude that the action would not have a significant impact on the environment and issue a FONSI. And then you don't have to do an EIS. Okay, then you're done. So that's that finding of no significant impact. Okay, if there is not a FONSI, then the next thing that an agency will have to do is create an environmental impact statement. And going back to those CEQ proposed regs. These were proposals, to speed up the process, to give people less time, to maybe require less looks on these environmental impact statements, um, so that federal action could proceed in a quicker fashion. Okay, so environmental impact statement. If there's no FONSI, there's no categorical exclusion, it's a major action, then the agency will have to create an environmental impact statement. Okay, so if this happens after the EA, the agency publishes in the Federal Register their notice of intent, NOI, to complete what we call a draft environmental impact statement, DEIS, in the Federal Register. And the EIS is a detailed, so the first one was just kind of an overview, a detailed analysis of the environmental impact of whatever the proposed federal action is. Okay, as part of the EIS, sometimes agencies work in cooperation with each other. Say the Power Commission and the Army Corps of Engineers, right? They're working together to create something. In the EIS, a lead agency must be designated. So they say, well, who's the one who's really doing most of the work? So that's the lead agency, and they are designated and they complete the EIS. The other agencies are called cooperating agencies. Now, it can be created by the agency itself, or you can use outside consultants to assist you or to create the EIS. Now, they can't have a financial interest in the agency action, either going through or stopping. So they have to, be non-biased. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, we're going to designate our lead agency and talk about our cooperating agencies, figure out who is going to create it. The next big thing in the EIS is scoping. So scoping identifies and addresses all significant issues relating to the proposed action. So they're getting like, okay, what are we doing? What's our parameters? What are we looking at? Okay, what are all our issues? What's the timetable? We start kind of polling the public on their views to this. We're working on still identifying alternatives to this project, maybe more environmentally friendly alternatives, or maybe the other alternatives are worse, so that we figure out what the alternatives are to this, and then you figure out which one's the best for the environment. Environmental data is all gathered for all of the potential alternatives for this project. So those are things we're doing. So things that are in your EIS: expected environmental impacts of a proposed project, unavoidable adverse environmental impacts. Okay, sometimes there are, even if I'm building a new sidewalk, right? I might displace an anthill or something, right? So that's an environmental impact, but it might be unavoidable. Okay, reasonable alternatives. You don't have to, create something out of the Jetsons or some futuristic item which is unavailable. And then the balance. Remember, that was part of the whole congressional statement of the environmental policy, balancing the intended use versus how we're going to need this bit of the environment long term. What is the cumulative impact of this agency action? Okay. Any irreversible or irretrievable commitment of resources to the proposed project. And then I just have a link to the Illinois Department of Transportation website where they have like a whole page of their kind of EISs and EAs, just so you can take a gander, and you can do this kind of on your own too. So it's idot.il/transportation-system/environmental-review-documents. Okay, so these are kind of like different routes that have been proposed. Here's one that just has an environmental assessment. And then here's one down in Macomb where there is a draft. Oh, it's an old one, but it doesn't matter. Draft environmental impact statement. And then we can download that PDF. That's just the cover. But yeah, you see here, this is all good stuff. There's a FONSI here. This one is, this ESA. Oh, I'm going to get to, this is a draft one. And let me get out of there. Look at what we have. Can it tell me how many pages there are from here? I don't know. Table of contents, summary, proposed and need for the action, the environment effective, alternatives, environmental consequences, who prepared them, our agencies, comments, and then you have all of your appendices. So I'm going to get to the comments and coordination. Can I get there? No, come on. Table of contents? This is not. Oh, this is just the cover page. It's not even like the real one here that I'm looking at. So it's just giving me the cover sheet of all of that. So that's not helpful. Let me go back to this other one. So if I look, say, to this executive summary for this McLean County one, you can open. Oh, this one's pretty, a little more recent. And let's see, can we see how many pages this one is? Okay, 2016. Why doesn't it tell me how many pages? This is just the executive summary of it. So here's all of, the agencies that are involved. Look at that. That's crazy. And then we have appendix of maps, air quality, clearances. And here's our impact, social and economic, agricultural resources, air quality, traffic noise, visual. So, that's a lot of stuff. Permit information. Here's all, just natural resources that they are looking at. And then purpose and need. So crazy. So, you can take a little time to look at these specific sections here, but they divvy it out into separate PDFs just because they're so big. And that's some sort of East Side Highway in McLean County. I'm trying to think if I don't see anything kind of more recent by IDOT, and nothing really close to home either. But that's just kind of an example of the things that they're looking at. One of the other things that you can do with an EIS is called tiering, like a level. So the process of tiering is when you have a long-term project, which will have a number of phases, you're kind of creating just one EIS, but you're breaking them up and addressing what's going on with the first phase first, rather than saying like, well, we're going to be doing this 20 years from now. You might not want to be looking at the environmental impact of that right now because everything's going to change, right? And maybe technology will change, and even who knows if the project will even go through in 20 years. Okay. It's not required, but it is helpful for long-term projects rather than creating multiple EISs. So in 20 years, we go back to our original EIS and we're saying like, okay, tier 2 of EIS, blah, blah, blah. So I don't have to go back to scoping and lead agency designation and things like that. So that's called tiering, and it happens sometimes, but not always. Okay, so here's some parts of a typical DEIS. You have that executive summary. We just saw that on the IDOT page. Okay, description of the proposed project, the purpose, why do we need this proposed action? Okay, some significant issues, alternatives, financials, how does it affect the environment, the environmental consequences, what mitigation are they going to do? And then they summarize any public involvement and any agency involvement. Okay, so in a case, we have Natural Resources Defense Council versus Morton in 1972. So look at the date on that. That's pretty quickly after NEPA was enacted. So I guess it was must have been probably the Bureau of Land Management again. Yeah, that's usually who deals with oil leases. So this Defense Council opposed oil leasing offshore in Louisiana. So that would be federal permits or leases for kind of federal lands to drill for oil off the coast of Louisiana. Okay, so what the plaintiffs challenged was that under NEPA that the agency did not look at alternatives to this. Okay, and they thought that there was an impact on marshland, oil pollution, and they didn't address things like, if they have to dredge, what environmental impact that would have, salt water, somehow, once you dredge water, then the salt water might go into marshlands or freshwater areas where the dumping debris would be. Okay, 1970s, you guys are probably all too young to remember, but there was big issue on oil. Okay, so Middle East was reining in their sale of oil to the United States. So we were in an energy crisis. Okay, and which makes sense. And like, oh, we should have our own oil, right? That's what the government was thinking. But the court held that the EIS, the environmental impact statement, has to include the impact of alternatives, okay, to the fullest extent possible. They don't have to be exhaustive, but they're like, well, is there a different way to do this? They had to look at it. And since they didn't look at that, those oil leases did not satisfy NEPA requirements. So we talked about cumulative effects a few slides back, but that, is how have the activities in this area, what's been done, past, present, what are the future activities? What's going to be the effect in the long term? And if these long-term effects can somehow be mitigated, made less, then the EIS has to explore that and identify how. Yeah. One of the statute requires that that the EIS, those be clear and concise. You saw the size of them. They are very lengthy, little funny. And again, that was one of the things that in those CEQ proposed regs that you were dealing with, that they sought to make the EISs not as lengthy. Oh, the old Butts case. Minnesota Public Interest Research Group versus Butts. And this is, there were logging contracts in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. I don't know if any of you guys have been up there. I think it's pretty pristine up there. And, look at that, 1 million acres of lake, streams, and timber. And, it's a big hiking, canoeing, camping area. And there's a lot of timber. Okay. And there were logging contracts, right? So this land is owned by the federal government and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And there were logging contracts to certain entities, allowing them to take a certain amount of timber every year. And the Forest Service modified those logging contracts. So they were there. I don't know if they increased them, they changed them, they had different people that they gave the logging contracts to, but they were modified. So the question is, well, is the modification of these existing logging contracts a major action? And did logging somehow negatively impact the environment? So there was an impact, and they should prepare an EIS to anticipate a cumulatively significant impact on the environment. So, right, the logging is a continuing contract. So the agency has to do an EIS if they're changing anything to the logging contract. So it was a major federal action, and they did have to create an EIS for it. Yeah. So they're saying that, even if there's indirect effects, NEPA, you have to look at them. And even if you think it's insignificant, but if we got rid of all the trees in a wilderness, there's going to be, ripple effects elsewhere in the environment. Okay. So again, there is an EIS. Okay. So after you have that DIS, right? Then the DIS is submitted to the public for comments. That's 45 days. The public can look at this draft EIS, make comments. And then your final EIS, FEIS, would include a summary of public comments and agency responses. Okay. And then your final EIS, based on the comments, based on your examination of all the alternative options, they present what we call the preferred alternative, or the locally preferred alternative, LPA, which is their recommendation for the project. Okay. And in that LPA, they're committing to mitigation measures. There may be interagency agreements, who does what and when. And then the FEIS is submitted to the public for comments. And then after all of that public comments, we have what's called a record of decision, ROD. Okay, so when the agency makes their final decision concerning an action that was subject to NEPA, and they formally approve that locally preferred alternative. So yeah, and if there's any changes to the plan that are made at some point down the road, you might have to supplement your EIS a little bit. So if there's any issue with the agency complying with NEPA or not, that's what the court reviews, this ROD, the record of decision. And the court does what's called a well, they want to see if the agency did what we call a hard look. It's the hard look doctrine, right? They have to, if they have done a hard look under NEPA, the agency decision is difficult to challenge, right? Usually, once the agency, right, even under the APA, Administrative Procedures Act, as long as the agency action was not arbitrary or capricious, agency action usually stands. So that's what, the agency gives a hard look. The Supreme Court gives a hard look as to whether the agency followed NEPA. And as long as the agency followed NEPA, the agency decision will stand. Okay, let's just take a break. I don't think I have a specific assignment for you to go through, but so as to not make this section of the lecture too onerous, and then we'll come back in a minute.